Welcome to Christian Truth in what is our God's Medicine series. This is episode 2, the FDA. Now, the reason that I wanted to discuss the FDA today is because there seems to be a big disparity. I wanted to show you here a poll. There seems to be a big disparity in what I hear from Christians and what I hear from the general populace. So I wanted to look at that issue. So here is a survey from realgoodnews.com. It says, do you think the FDA protects people from dangerous drugs? And let's look at the results. So we see from the results, most people think that the FDA does not protect them from dangerous drugs. We have very low margin who thinks they do, and pretty low margin of who says sometimes they do. So what I want to talk about is the disparity between the answers I get from Christians and the answers I get from general society. Now, in general society, they usually tell me no, that they do not trust the FDA. But when I speak with Christians, I generally get a yes. So we're going to come back to that in a little bit. I want to do a real quick recap of our first episode where we just talked about passages in the Bible that talk about God's medicine. Genesis 9:3. Even as the green herb, I've given you all things. In Ezekiel, when he was speaking of the tree, what they were calling the tree of life, which grew beside the river and grew 12 fruits, one for each season, he said, the fruit thereof shall be for meat, and the leaf thereof for medicine. So there are lots of scriptures in the Bible that talk about food as medicine, and I apologize for not having all of them listed here, but for time's sake, I've not done that. Now, let's talk about what the Bible had said about pharmaceuticals. In Webster's Collegiate Dictionary from 1980, pharmaceutical is described as the practice of witchcraft or the use of poison. And then when we move into the Bible and we get into Strong's Exhaustive Concordance of the Bible, we see sorcery listed as, and this is translated from the original Greek pharmakon, we see it listed as a drug. For example, a spell-giving potion, a druggist or a pharmacist, a poisoner. So we see from this definition that a modern-day doctor or pharmacist, at least according to the Bible or Strong's Exhaustive Concordance, is a sorcerer. And we also see in the Bible that in Revelations it says, for by thy sorceries, or pharmacia by this definition, were all nations deceived. Now, let's just look at that, how all nations are deceived. All nations are deceived because these drugs turn us into zombies. And this was not done by accident. Let's just take a look at our FDA and who runs the FDA, because that's what I really want to talk about. I want to wake up some of my Christian friends to what's actually going on in the world. And for those of you who are having a hard time bearing with me, let me assure you that I'm having a difficult time having this conversation as well. We're going to go into some things that I didn't want to go into today, but I feel like it's necessary to go into those areas in order for you to truly understand what's going on in the world today and how that fits into the Word of God and God's medicine. So let's take a look at who our FDA is, who most Christians believe does protect us from drugs. And we see here that now with Dr. Robert Califf, that EcoWatch is claiming the FDA officially belongs to Big Pharma. Now, when we get into this, we'll see why they say that. And that is because he also served as a high-level pharma officer, say press reports. He served as director, officer, partner, employee, advisor, consultant, or trustee for Genentech. He's also had ties to Johnson & Johnson, Lilly, Merck, Schering-Plough, and GSK, according to a disclosure statement on the website at Duke Clinical Research Institute. So this is a guy who has huge ties to Big Pharma. And so his interest is obviously going to be in the interest of the drug companies that he's worked for in the past and will undoubtedly work for when he comes back out. So let's take a look at, well, I thought I had it here, but if we look into our previous head of the FDA, we'll see that he had ties to Monsanto. So the same thing happens with the FDA that happens with many other departments in the government, which is guys come out of those industries in highly paid positions, they go into government positions, and they go right back out of those government positions into these big company positions again. So let's don't delude ourselves to think that these guys aren't benefiting from moving into those government positions. Now, another one of the difficult things that I wanted to talk to you about today, because it relates so heavy and it's just almost impossible to get away from when you're talking about God's medicine. It's just impossible to get away from this subject. And so we have to talk about cannabis if we're going to talk about God's medicine. And when we talk about cannabis, we can talk about people like Jaden David, who had hundreds of seizures a day his entire life until he was given cannabis oil. And those seizures stopped that very same day. We have to talk about Angela Brown, who faces prison for saving her son's life. After the doctors failed him, she decided to treat him with cannabis oil, which worked like a miracle, saved the child's life, and now she's facing prison. We have to talk about Tommy Chong, who went on TV and said he would cure his cancer with hemp oil and diet. And then he did it. And we have to look at the facts. When we do talk about cannabis, we have to look at what's really going on with cannabis. And there's a lot more going on with this plant than most people have been led to believe. The research, though, shows that it could have incredible effects on very condition-specific areas. If we look at this chart here, we see that one component of marijuana, the CBCA, actually reduces inflammation and treats fungal infection. We see that the CBDs inhibit cancer cell growth, promote bone growth, reduce inflammation, relieve pain. We see that CBGA, another component, reduces inflammation, relieves pain, and slows bacterial growth. So we're going to have to give up on the notion that medical marijuana is bunk. This is God's medicine. This was created by God. This is not tampered with by sorcery. This is the way God gave it to us. And while we speak about that and how it's God's medicine, you should also know, and I apologize that I didn't bring up a graphic for it. I hope that you'll bear with me. I'm very new to these recordings, but you can Google it yourself. It has been proven. There is a doctor who has proven that every mammal has cannabidiol receptors in their body. Now, why would we have these receptors if our bodies did not need this nutrition? We have receptors for other things in the body that we need. We need iodine. We have receptors for that in our thyroid. We need minerals. We have receptors for those in our cells. Why would we have receptors for cannabidiols if we didn't need them? So, before we start throwing away God's plants and God's medicine, before we make a decision about what's actually going on there. Let's get the facts, because the facts are, as afraid as we are of cannabis, there have been 0 deaths from cannabis. And a lot of Christians, although they don't like it, they certainly don't rail against tobacco the way they do cannabis. Now, let's talk about who is the enemy. If God's plants and God's medicine aren't the enemy, who actually is? Well, we have the Bible to tell us that. In Ephesians 6:12, it says, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." And where do we find spiritual wickedness in high places? Well, sometimes we find it in government. As a matter of fact, most of the time we find it in government, as we see them consistently going after God's medicine rather than going after the real criminals in the world. And who is it that's against marijuana? Alcohol brewers, big pharma, who would rather you take their drugs and sorcery. The prisons, who make more money when we put marijuana offenders in jail. The police unions, because more criminals, let's face it, means more jobs. And the same goes for the prison guard unions. So when we think about God's medicine, we do have to include marijuana. And when we do have to look at the government and the wickedness in high places. And then let's look at who says that marijuana is actually medicine. Well, Dr. Sanjay Gupta says it's actually medicine. And he tells us that every 19 minutes, somebody dies of a prescription drug overdose. It just doesn't happen with marijuana. So we see that sorcery is killing people every 19 minutes, but not God's medicine. And here's more. This is a typical children's school lunch in the United States versus one in Italy. You think there might be a problem there? Here's your government in action. So before we confine ourselves to the legacy of slavery, let's think about what it is that we're doing. Let's think about what it is that we're supporting. Let's think about what it is that we actually believe. Because we see that the further a society drifts from the truth, the more it will hate those who speak it. And I hope that you don't hate me today as I come and I speak the truth. I want you to understand that God has given us every medicine on earth that we need, and we need to get back to those foods and get away from this sorcery. Buckminster Fuller tells us that it's now highly feasible to take care of everybody on earth at a higher standard of living than we have ever known. It's no longer has to be you or me. Selfishness is unnecessary. War is obsolete. It's a matter of converting our high technology from weaponry to livingry. So before we think about supporting our governments or even fighting our governments, let's think about just focusing on what the world could be like if we had our God-given medicines and if we used those every day to heal. If we got rid of criminality in the government and got away from a criminal government who support the use of drugs and big pharma and got back to the use of God's medicines. Let's think about what kind of world we could have. And then, like the Bible says, to dwell on lovely things. One of my favorite passages that my dad used to point out to me all the time. Think on lovely things. So let's try to do that as we move forward. Because the real truth is that these guys are the rulers in dark places. These are the principalities spoken of in the Bible who are our enemies. And it's proven in their actions. So let's not get tied up in that. Let's not get hung up on left wing and right wing. And let's get on to a lifestyle of knowing. I want to encourage you to, once you know the truth, to speak it. As difficult as it is, and this has been extremely difficult for me today, But I'm sticking through it as hard as it is to bring you this information. I want you to have this information. I think it's important. And I hope that once you learn this information, you won't be silenced either. I want you to remember that blind belief in authority is the greatest enemy of truth. So for those of you who, like myself, have friends who do believe in a criminal and corrupt government and who've turned away from God's medicine, I want you to encourage them to find the truth as well. We all have to look and find the truth, because it's the truth that's going to set us free. And it's in the truth that we'll find freedom, righteousness, love, and everything that we find virtuous. So let's don't buy into the lies anymore. Let's don't buy into the fear-mongering. Let's don't buy into the brainwashing of the criminal government. Let's instead look for the truth, and let's move into the age of knowing. I want to thank you for joining me today for what has been a very difficult episode for me. However, I hope you have found it informative. I hope that you like, subscribe, and most of all, share. And I hope that you'll join us in our upcoming episodes. I did promise that we would be looking at specific medicines for specific cures, and we will be doing that in upcoming issues. I just felt like I had to get past this FDA issue before we went on. So I'm excited about where we're going to be going in the future, and I want to thank you so much for joining me.